Hello everyone and a warm welcome to the first special edition of Zeitgeist, the Saxony magazine, brought to you by Saxony Tourism. My name is Wolfgang Gärtner and I will take you back into the age of Baroque today. So let me introduce you to a person who is much more important than me and who has left a lasting impact on Saxony. Saxony's ruler, Augustus the Strong, was a strong king. He was sophisticated, educated, charming, confident, and just a little bit crazy. Share his adventures by watching this special edition of Zeitgeist, the Saxony magazine, and discover his beautiful legacy in the state of Saxony, Germany. The 30 Years' War in the first half of the 17th century had devastated Saxony, just like all other regions of the German Empire. In terms of territory, Saxony was a winner though. Also, Saxony recovered much faster than other regions, thanks to expanding and modernizing the mining operations in the Ore Mountains, a strategy always applied in times of crisis. So Augustus's grandfather, John George II, rang in the Baroque age in Saxony and could afford to indulge in a splendid and luxurious lifestyle, with French Sun King Louis XIV being the chief inspiration. Born in 1670, little Prince Augustus, actually Frederick Augustus, was impressed by his grandfather's style of holding court. And it made him look forward to a carefree and joyful life, since he was only the second-born son, a fact that nevertheless bothered him quite a lot. Many tales are told about Augustus the Strong, and most of them are not true. But I have secured him a place amongst the most legendary rulers in Europe. And while he was only my size, his physical strength was really impressive. Frederick Augustus I of Saxony was not called Augustus the Strong for nothing. Breaking horseshoes seems to have been one of his ways to demonstrate his strength. This one can be found in the Royal Palace in Dresden. It comes with a certificate of origin issued by Augustus himself. And who would dare to doubt his royal authority? Here's the thumbprint that Augustus left behind on a railing of Brute's Terrace, right over the remains of Dresden's fortifications. Beware of a nearby forgery, which is intended to fool tourists. The original here, at least, dates back to the year 1747, which is only 14 years after Augustus's death. But psst, don't give away the secret. Augustus considered himself better suited to be ruler than his older brother. After his brother died of a fatal disease in 1694, Augustus became Elector of Saxony. This made him one of the most important rulers in Germany. By God's grace, King of Poland, Grand Duke of Lithuania, Hereditary Duke of Saxony, Marshal and Elector of the Holy Roman Empire, Landgrave in Thuringia, Margrave of Meissen and of Upper Lusatia and Lower Lusatia. 3 years later, he was also voted King of Poland. Now he was even one of the most important rulers of Europe. This is what Augustus was wearing when he was crowned King of Poland. A lot of his clothing is on display here in the staterooms in the Royal Palace in Dresden. Since this wax figure was made during his lifetime, we know how he really looked like. Now, Augustus had to split his time between Dresden and the Polish capital, Warsaw. His treasures needed to travel with him. And as you can see here in the Greenwald Treasury Museum in the Royal Palace, they had customized packaging for the treasures to protect them on the journey. While Poland was the largest empire of Europe at that time, Dresden was 6 times larger than Warsaw. And with its newfound royal status, the Saxon capital had to become much more representative. And it did. This is the crown gate of the famous Dresden Zwinger, built by Augustus. It is crowned by the Polish crown, which can also be found on other parts of the building. Augustus's family ruled Saxony for 829 years, until Saxony became a republic in 1918. All the rulers from the House of Wettin are depicted on the so-called procession of princes on the outer wall of the stable yard of the royal palace in Dresden. It was created in the late 19th century. There was one thing that Augustus was not forgiven for. To become king of Poland, he converted to Catholicism. And while he's depicted here in all of his glory, his horse tramples a flower with one hoof, the Luther rose, showing that he was seen, and maybe still is seen, as a traitor by the Protestants here in the motherland of the Reformation. Augustus was very well qualified to rule both Saxony and Poland. He had enjoyed an excellent education and had been on an extensive grand tour of Europe. In France, he had spent time at the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose splendor he not only aimed to match, but to surpass. At around 1500, porcelain reached Europe. Soon the manufactories in China and Japan started creating items just for export to the Old World, which were sold here for premium prices. The sheer beauty and perfection of the porcelain could not be ignored, and it would make even strong Augustus weak. Augustus the Strong suffered heavily from the porcelain disease. He even traded soldiers in exchange for porcelain from China and Japan. These are the so-called dragoon vases. Augustus sold 600 horse riders from his cavalry to the Prussian king in exchange for 151 porcelain items, including one of these vases. He loved it so much that he later purchased more of the same in the Netherlands. But collecting porcelain was an expensive hobby. Porcelain was not called white gold for nothing. So like many others before him, Augustus wanted to make his own porcelain. Everybody else had failed. But Augustus was determined to succeed. European hard-paste porcelain was invented in Dresden in 1708. It was not a coincidence, even though this tale is still told today. Augustus had taken the alchemist Johann Friedrich Böttcher, who claimed that he could make gold, into protective custody. After having to confess that he could not make gold, Böttcher was put to the task of making porcelain instead, aided by the best Saxon scientists and mining experts. His lab was in this part of the mighty Dresden fortifications, known as the Maiden Bastion. It is here where the first European porcelain was manufactured, hence the term Dresden China. But soon a new facility was required, equally safe but much bigger. Located on the castle hill of Meissen, Germany's oldest palace, built in the late 15th century and known as Albrechtsburg today, had stood empty. For more than 100 years, it became the new production site of the porcelain manufactory, and Dresden China turned into Meissen porcelain. After the manufactory had moved out, the palace was restored and beautifully decorated with scenes from the Saxon history. But the real star is the architecture in a unique late Gothic style invented by architect Arnold of Westphalia. Since the middle of the 19th century, Meissen porcelain has been made in a custom-built manufactory in the Triebisch Valley, close to the town center. It is still considered to be the finest in the world, and it carries the world's oldest trademark, the crossed blue swords. The history of Meissen porcelain is well documented in the manufactory's museum. In Dresden, Augustus intended to dedicate a whole palace to his love for porcelain. He had a Japanese palace built, which was supposed to be decorated with porcelain even from the outside. The project was never completed, and over time, porcelain became less important. However, Augustus's collection survived in large parts. It consists of Chinese and Japanese porcelain and early Meissen porcelain. Today, it's on display in the so-called porcelain collection of the Dresden State Art Collections in the Dresden Zwinger, which, of course, was built by Augustus himself. Augustus was never healed from the porcelain disease, but he learned how to live with it and found himself a cure. Augustus the Strong felt like he was second to none. His absolutistic rule was never challenged, but even he had to bow to a higher power, the power of love. And the name of love was Anna Constantia. Augustus the Strong's great love was Anna Constantia, the Countess of Cosel. In 1704, he made her his mistress, the woman to his left. The woman to his right was, of course, his wife, Christiane Eberhardine. But she had left Dresden with their son because she didn't agree with Augustus' decision to convert to Catholicism to become King of Poland. Maybe she was also a little fed up with having to share her husband with his mistresses. To have Anna Constantia close to him always, Augustus had the Taschenberg Palace erected right next to his royal palace. The Taschenberg Palace was later expanded and now serves as a grand hotel. Now, Anna Constantia was almost always on Augustus' side, having great influence over him. But her personality led to many people at court becoming her enemy. Eventually, Augustus banished her from Dresden. Anna Constantia remembered that Augustus had given her a written promise to marry her if his wife were to die. She tried to recover the document from Berlin, where her brother had taken it to. But leaving Saxony without Augustus's permission was equal to treason. She was captured and held at Nossen Castle, and then she was brought here, to Stolpen. First, Anna Constantia lived in elegant rooms in the armory, holding court and always hoping that Augustus would return to her. But while he took great care of the 3 children they had had together, he never showed his face in Stolpen. For Augustus, it was clearly over. After a fire, Anna Constantia had to move into this tower, St. John's Tower, today mostly called Kosel Tower. At times, she must have felt like Rapunzel. In this tower, she spent the last 20 years of her life. Voluntarily, since the ban had been lifted, and nobody knows why. Altogether, she stayed for 49 years in Stolpen Castle, and she died at the age of 84 in the year 1765. Anna Constantia was buried in the chapel of the castle, of which only the foundations remain. But her memory lives on. Christiane Eberhardine had already died in 1727. She and Augustus had always maintained a courteous relationship. Augustus never married again. The Ottoman Empire was a constant threat to Europe, particularly to the so-called Holy Roman Empire of German nation, the association of independent states that the German emperor presided over. Rank-wise, Augustus the Strong was his deputy. So, he was put in charge of the imperial army in Hungary, fighting the Turks quite successfully, even if war never brought him too much joy. However, like many others, he felt intimidated by the military strength of the Turks, but was equally fascinated with their culture. Augustus was magically attracted to exotic things. He had a Turkish mistress, Fatima, and sent his chamberlain, actually her husband, on a shopping spree to the Ottoman Empire to fill his Turkish chamber. The Turkish fashion lasted from the 16th to the 18th century. And in Dresden's royal palace, one of the best collections of Ottoman art outside of Turkey can be found. Very few pieces came here as booty. Most of them were purchased or even made here in the Ottoman style. Augustus contributed greatly, including this amazing tent, which came to Dresden in 1729. Some other pieces here are even unique, and the collection from the 16th century is beyond compare. Augustus compared himself with the richest man of his time, the Indian Mughal ruler Aurangzeb. His court jeweler, Johann Melchior Dinglinger, made him a large-scale replica of Aurangzeb's court, using gold, silver and precious stones. "7 years in the making, it is a unique piece of art with high play value. Most people would assume it's a product of vivid imagination. The contrary is true. Dinglinger used an exact description of Aurangzeb's birthday party, written down by a traveler who had attended the festivities. The figurines are real people with real names. The only elements added are the Chinese elements, since this is a product of the so-called chinoiserie, or Chinese fashion, with China standing for the whole of Asia. The Far East was as fascinating as the Ottoman Empire. but it didn't pose a threat. Dinglinger was the last jeweler in Europe to create large-scale jewelry pieces. Most of his works are on display here in the Greenwald Treasury Museum in Dresden's Royal Palace, including this, the almost equally famous golden coffee set. It shows how quickly the Saxons took to the exotic new drink after the Turks had left bags of coffee beans behind after the failed siege of Vienna, where Augustus's father had earned himself the title of honor Saxon Mars. Before the invention of European hard-paste porcelain in Dresden in 1708, Augustus bought large quantities of Asian porcelain. His collection of Chinese and Japanese porcelain can still be admired today in the so-called porcelain collection of the Dresden State Art Collections in the Dresden Zwinger. While other rulers merely built pavilions in the Chinese style, Augustus erected a whole palace on the banks of the River Elbe in Pillnitz, today part of Dresden. The lavish decorations were both inspired by the Baroque style and by the decorations on porcelain imported from Asia, which suggested a carefree lifestyle in the Far East, which was sharply at contrast with the strict protocol at the court. Pillnitz Palace was later expanded, but even the additions from the 19th century paid tribute to the Chinese fashion that Augustus loved as much as anything else that was exotic. Exotic elements were integrated by Augustus into almost everything. When he married his son to the daughter of the German emperor, he received the bride and groom dressed like a sultan. Their wedding gift was the Turkish palace, which was nothing else but Countess Kosel's former Taschenberg palace, revamped in the Turkish style. Augustus the Strong drove his teachers crazy. The only one he really respected was Wolf Caspar von Klengel, chief Saxon architect and father of Saxon Baroque architecture. Since Augustus hated to be educated in a study room, von Klengel took him on excursions and involved him in the design of buildings. Augustus was thrilled, and the seeds for one of his passions were sown. From a subsequent grand tour, he came back with equally grand ideas of turning Dresden into the Venice of the North and Saxony into a modern land of Baroque. Augustus the Strong had splendid buildings built, each for a special purpose. This led to the construction of Augustus's fairground. This is the Dresden Zwinger. Augustus had most of the fortifications knocked down to make space for new representative buildings. But in this case, he wanted an open space for outdoor festivities. Then an orangery was added, and this evolved into an ensemble of beautiful buildings. So where does the name come from? Zwinger is a military term, and it denotes the space between two walls of the fortifications. What makes the Zwinger so special is the combination of architecture and sculpting. Even while the Zwinger was still under construction, some of the ever-growing collections of Augustus moved into the buildings, and they are still used by the Dresden State Art Collections today. In one segment, the so-called Zwinger Experience can be found, which tells the history of the Zwinger. In some guidebooks, This is called the Zwinger Palace. While the Zwinger was never a palace, it could have become part of one. Augustus wanted to build a new and modern palace which would have been bigger than Versailles, and he wanted to incorporate the Zwinger into this new palace. But it still stands alone in all of its splendor. Augustus's hunting grounds. This is Moritzburg Castle. Like all his ancestors, Augustus was very fond of hunting. He took a small hunting lodge built for Elector Moritz in the 16th century and had it rebuilt into a much larger Baroque structure. Moritzburg Castle sits beautifully on an artificial island in an artificial lake. The existing chapel remained untouched and was integrated into the new structure. After all, it was the work of Augustus's former teacher, Wolf Caspar von Klengel. It was here in 1699 when the first Catholic church service after the Reformation was held, 2 years after Augustus had converted to Catholicism to become King of Poland. The rooms in Moritzburg Castle are famous for their leather wall coverings. They have survived throughout the centuries. Apart from a small area in this room, where a practical-minded Soviet soldier cut out a piece to repair his shoes at the end of World War II. This room is decorated with beautiful paintings and fine fabrics. So it seems. In reality, these are millions of bird feathers. The last restoration took 30 years. Each feather was taken out, cleaned and stitched back in. The feather room is unique and typical for Augustus's love for the extraordinary. Augustus's porcelain palace. This is the Japanese palace in Dresden. It came into existence when Augustus decided to build a home for his porcelain collection. As a tribute to the many pieces of Chinese and Japanese porcelain that he owned, the building was erected in the chinoiserie style, while the roof was inspired by Japanese architecture. On the relief, on the gable over the main entrance, there are Asians and Saxons presenting their porcelain products to the goddess Saxonia. Augustus's porcelain palace was never fully realized. In his vision, practically everything was supposed to be made from porcelain. Some pieces of the interior were completed and they are now on display in the Dresden Zwinger, where Augustus's porcelain collection can be found today. The organ with porcelain pipes that he ordered could not be realized at that time, but it was duly completed by the Meissen State Porcelain Manufactory 300 years later. It can now be found in the Meissen Porcelain Museum. Augustus's playground. As a gift from Augustus, Pillnitz Castle on the outskirts of Dresden became the property of Anna Constantia, the Countess of Cosel. After she had fallen out of favor, Augustus resumed ownership and had a new palace built. The old castle burned down later. All that remains is this bastion with a lion's head. In accordance with his plans to make Dresden the Venice of the North, Augustus had the first structures built here on the water. The hill palace followed later. Augustus and his guests would come here by gondola, of course. Apart from its distinctive architecture and the chinoiserie or Chinese style, Pillnitz Palace is famous for its gardens. The French or formal garden was already established by Countess Kosul. Later, an English-style landscape park was added, as was a botanical garden. Further, buildings on the grounds include the palm house, the orangery, 2 pavilions, and a glass house on rails to protect Europe's oldest camellia in winter. An idea that could have easily come from Augustus himself. And Augustus's garden paradise. This is Großsedlitz Baroque Garden. In 1723, Augustus the Strong took a fancy to the mansion and the orangery that one of his most important ministers, Imperial Count August Christoph von Wackerbarth, had just erected here. Wackerbarth had to sell the property to his master and carry on with the construction work, now according to Augustus's ideas. Augustus wanted nothing less than a Saxon Versailles. Augustus had founded the Order of the White Eagle, which was celebrated on these grounds every year. Plans to replace the mansion and the orangery with a much larger palace never came to fruition. The Festival of the White Eagle required much more garden space than Wackerbarth had allocated. So the grounds were vastly expanded. Only 1/3 was completed, leaving it a torso, if a very beautiful one. Augustus's vision became full reality in the area of the lower orangery. Bitter oranges were most important to Augustus, since they were seen as the golden apples of the Hesperides that Hercules had to steal as one of his labors. Augustus saw himself as Hercules Saxonicus, fit for any Herculean task. Augustus decreed that his son's wedding to the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor should be celebrated for 4 weeks, something Europe had never seen before. There were festivals in honor of each planet. He received his daughter-in-law in the magnificent purpose-built staterooms in the royal palace in Dresden. Augustus had accepted that his plans to build a completely new palace could not be realized in time for the wedding of his son in 1719. Luckily, at least from Augustus' perspective, a fire in the old palace enabled him to refurbish large parts of it. The staterooms not only demonstrate Baroque splendor, but also superior workmanship. Augustus was a great facilitator who brought together some of the best artists and craftsmen of his time to create something that was bigger than the sum of its parts. Augustus received his guests in the audience chamber, sitting on a throne. The painting on the ceiling depicts Hercules defeating the three vices of anger, slander, and envy. Remember, Augustus saw himself as Hercules Saxonicus, fighting evil and upholding the virtues. This beautiful bed has never been slept in. In fact, it's not even a proper bed, it's a mock-up. The parade bedroom only served as a place for intimate meetings between Augustus and the chosen few. It was here that Augustus and his wife received the bridal couple. Augustus did not live in the staterooms, but in a comfortable apartment in the Gate building. But he definitely knew how to present himself to the outside world. And Augustus kept up the good work. In the last year of his life, he established the Firearms Gallery in the so-called Long Corridor, which connects the royal palace with the royal stables. Today, around 500 firearms are on display, which distinguish themselves from their peers by outstanding technical features and elaborate decorations. It seems that Augustus wanted to go out with a bang. Resentful historians later accused Augustus of being wasteful and decadent. But he was just a typical and certainly a most remarkable representative of his time. And what would the architecture of Saxony be like without all the splendid buildings he left behind? To make all his newly erected buildings shine even more, Augustus the Strong had to fill them with beautiful and precious items. No problem for him, since he had created a network of art experts in Europe. They would source whatever his heart desired. Also, he appointed a large number of excellent artists to his court. So, a lot of good pieces found their way into his various palaces. But what to do with the very best of them? Augustus the Strong collected everything that was especially beautiful and valuable. Designed by Augustus, Dresden's royal palace has one of the most famous treasure troves in the world, and it was already open to the public as early as 1724. But, like today, only for a limited number of visitors and with an entrance fee. However, clean clothes, as ordered by Augustus, are no longer absolutely necessary today. But they are probably more appropriate to the splendor of the so-called Green Vault. It is one of the best treasury museums in the world. What makes it special is that the objects are not behind glass. Each room is dedicated to one precious material. There's so much that the original rooms created by Augustus now form the historic Green Vault, which are only accessible with time slot tickets. More treasures can be found one floor up in the so-called modern Green Vault. There the items are behind anti-glare glass. Augustus also established a fantastic collection of antique sculptures and paintings, now on display in the Old Masters Picture Gallery, which can be found in the so-called Semper building that connects the Zwinger with the theatre square. While Augustus' son did not share his father's passion for women and architecture, his love for paintings was even bigger. After all, when we talk about Augustus, we always talk about the Augustan age, which also included his son, who was named after his father. The long-lasting impact of the 30 Years' War was finally over, and the economy boomed under the rule of Augustus the Strong. Like in crisis situations before, mining in the ore mountains revived the economy. But Augustus also founded a number of successful manufactories. With the growth of wealth, the face of Saxony's capital, Dresden, changed dramatically. Augustus the Strong turned Dresden into a magnificent Baroque city. Since he wanted to make Dresden the Venice of the North, he also donated money to rebuild the Church of Our Lady. Maybe Augustus felt guilty about converting to Catholicism, but maybe he also sensed an opportunity to get closer to turning his vision into a reality. The old church of Our Lady of Frauenkirche, the main Protestant church of the city, had to be replaced with a larger church on the same limited space. Augustus must have been very pleased when architect George Baer suggested to crown it with a dome, just like the church Maria della Salute in Venice. However, here the dome is made from stone and it's shaped like a bell, so the famous stone bell of Dresden was born. Augustus even had the fortress walls demolished to make rooms for new buildings like the famous Dresden Zwinger. The part of the Zwinger with the crown gate clearly sits on the walls of the former fortifications, to be exact, on a former bastion. And the lake you see in front of it used to be the moat. Matthäus Daniel Pöppelmann, the architect of the Zwinger, wanted a stone bridge across the moat, but the military chiefs demanded it to be built of wood, so they could burn it in case of an attack. Augustus could not care less, but he let them have their way. The only other part left of what was once the strongest defense system amongst German cities is this part here along the Elbe River. It became private property under Augustus' son, was repurposed and thus saved from demolition. Inside, the Festung or fortress experience tells the story of Dresden's fortifications, including the time when the European hard porcelain was invented here under Augustus' rule. A big fire on the other side of the Elbe River gave him the opportunity to build a city of his own. Augustus got the idea for a planned city with a symmetrical layout from his old teacher, Wolf Caspar von Klengel. Now it could finally be realized. Like the rays of the sun, the new streets spread from the Bautzen Gate towards the Elbe River. The so-called Königstraße or King Street is the most splendid, as it points towards the Japanese palace. The new city was originally called the New Royal City near Dresden. Way too long. Today it's just called New City or Neustadt. The Church of the Three Magi had already been rebuilt after the fire, but it stood in the way of Augustus' plans for an ideal city of Baroque. So it was knocked down and replaced by a new church of the same name along the main axis. After destruction in World War II, it could only be rebuilt in the 1980s, this time as church and Congress Center. The altar was left in its mutilated state, but it still shows its former beauty. The altar is the work of Johann Benjamin Thome. This little garden in the Baroque style once belonged to him. Next to it is the Sozietätstheater, Dresden's oldest community theater. And the remaining Baroque houses are today often occupied by artisans. But something was still missing. The Golden Rider statue of Augustus still sits on the Neustadt market square, facing east towards Poland. Augustus might not like everything he sees today in front of him, but he was the only Saxon ruler to build his own city. After World War II, there were plans to knock down most of the remaining buildings from Augustus's times to make space for modern apartments built in the socialist style. It only happened to some unfortunate ones, but the others survived and were lovingly restored after German reunification, preserving Augustus's vision. Augustus the Strong had his first love affair at the age of 16, and many others followed. He enjoyed the game of love, but it was equally important to him to be seen by the public as an irresistible man. It was claimed that he had fathered 354 children, which was later rounded off to 365, so that there was one for every day of the year. Officially, he had only 9 children. So, were women his heirs? Very unlikely. Augustus suffered from diabetes, high blood pressure, and lipid metabolic disorder. No doubt caused by his unhealthy lifestyle. He still made it to the age of 62, maybe not in spite of the women, but because of them. Augustus the Strong loved beautiful women all his life, because he was not only Elector of Saxony, but also King of Poland. Augustus was buried in Krakow. But he requested that his heart should stay in Dresden, and it found its eternal rest in a capsule in the Catholic cathedral. There are 4 major burial sites for Saxony's royal family. The Catholic rulers from the 18th century onwards are buried here in the crypt of the former Catholic court church. Augustus the Strong only had a Catholic chapel, first in the royal palace, later in a former theater next to it. But his son had this cathedral built, and he moved the capsule into it as well. So, here Augustus's heart has found its final resting place. But is it resting? Even today, the heart beats when a beautiful woman passes by. Believe it or not, or come and see for yourself. One way or another, Augustus lives on until today. So, visit Saxony and explore his legacy here in Germany's #1 cultural destination. Thanks also to Augustus the Strong. Thank you for watching this special edition of Zeitgeist the Saxony magazine. watch out for the next regular edition in November, the new video Advent calendar December, and next year's special edition. Be strong as Augustus, build your own legend, and see you in Saxony.